We camped in the heart of winter for the serenity, but something was out there watching, and it didn't want us there. 3 true winter camping horror stories. The last story's ending is shocking, so make sure to watch till the end. It was supposed to be a peaceful retreat into the snowy wilderness. A winter camping trip with a group of friends, seeking solace from the chaos of the holidays. We chose a spot deep in the forest, surrounded by towering evergreens that sagged under the weight of fresh snow. The nearest town was an hour's drive away, and we hadn't seen another soul on the trails. It felt like we had the entire forest to ourselves. The first day was idyllic. We pitched our tents in a small clearing, gathered firewood, and cooked dinner over the flames while laughing and sharing stories. The air was crisp, the stars were impossibly bright, and the quiet of the forest was almost otherworldly. The first sign that something was wrong came in the early hours of the morning. I woke to the sound of crunching snow. Someone, or something, was walking outside our tent. The footfalls were slow and deliberate, circling the campsite. My heart raced as I strained to listen, but the steps eventually faded into silence. When I mentioned it the next morning, my friends shrugged it off, blaming wildlife. "It's probably just a deer," one said, though the unease in their voice betrayed their attempt to sound casual. But when we stepped out of our tents, the tracks in the snow told a different story. They were huge, larger than any humans or animals, and misshapen, as if something had been dragging its feet. That night the noises returned, and they were louder this time. The crunching of snow was accompanied by strange, guttural sounds that echoed through the trees. We sat around the fire, trying to ignore it, but the tension was palpable. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves made us jump. When we finally retreated to our tents, I could barely sleep. Around midnight, I heard the sound again, closer this time. Something leaned against the tent, the fabric bowing inward under the weight. My breath caught as a shadow passed over us, tall and misshapen, silhouetted by the faint light of the moon. I whispered to my friend, but they were already awake, frozen in fear. We didn't move until dawn, when the noises had finally stopped. The next morning, we found our campsite in disarray. Our gear had been rummaged through, claw marks were etched into the cooler, and symbols we didn't recognize were carved into the snow. Whatever had been there wasn't just an animal. It was something else entirely. We decided to leave, but the forest wasn't done with us. As we packed up, we felt an overwhelming sense of being watched. The air was thick with tension, and the silence was oppressive. As we made our way down the trail, I turned back one last time and froze. Something stood at the edge of the clearing, half hidden by the trees. It was tall, unnaturally so, with elongated limbs and a head that seemed to twist at an impossible angle. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the pale morning light. "Keep moving," one of my friends hissed, pulling me forward. We didn't stop until we reached the car. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that figure standing at the edge of the forest. We never spoke about what happened that weekend, and none of us have gone winter camping since. But every so often, I dream of the forest, of the tracks in the snow, and the shadow outside the tent. And I wake up with the same thought: whatever was out there is still waiting. The ice beneath us wasn't the only thing cracking that night. Our group thrived on adventure, and winter camping was the ultimate challenge. This time, we decided to camp by a frozen lake in a remote area, surrounded by snow-blanketed woods. It was picturesque, the kind of scene you'd expect to see on a postcard. The lake stretched out like a shimmering sheet of glass, reflecting the pale light of the moon. We set up our tents on the shore and built a roaring fire, laughing as we shared stories and warmed our hands. The first night was calm. The forest seemed to cocoon us in silence, broken only by the occasional crack of ice shifting on the lake. We joked about the cold, wrapped in layers of blankets, and drifted off to sleep under a star-studded sky. On the second night, things changed. As we sat around the fire, we began to hear a sound, a rhythmic tapping, faint but persistent. It seemed to come from the center of the lake. At first, we brushed it off, thinking it was just the ice settling, but as the hours passed, The tapping grew louder and more deliberate, like someone knocking methodically. Then came the voice. It was faint at first, a distant help carried by the wind. We froze, glancing at each other to confirm we weren't imagining it. The voice came again, clearer this time, pleading and urgent. It was coming from the middle of the lake. Against our better judgment, we grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the edge of the ice. "Hello?" one of us called out, but there was no response, only the tapping, now louder and closer. That's when we saw it. A figure stood in the middle of the lake, pale and motionless, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. The moonlight illuminated its gaunt form, making it seem almost translucent. It didn't move, didn't respond, just stood there, as if waiting. I shone the flashlight on it, and the beam flickered, the figure vanishing and reappearing with each blink of the light. Then it began to move, not walking, but gliding across the ice, its movements smooth and unnatural. Panic set in, and we backed away, stumbling over the snow as we retreated to the campsite. But the figure kept coming, its form growing clearer with each step. It wasn't just pale, it was wrong. Its limbs seemed too long, its eyes hollow and black. We scrambled into the tents, zipping them up as if the thin fabric would protect us. Outside, the tapping grew deafening, surrounding us. Then came the scratching, a slow, deliberate scrape against the tent walls, accompanied by the faint sound of laughter. None of us slept that night. At the first light of dawn, the sound stopped. We cautiously unzipped the tents and emerged to find the lake eerily still, the figure gone. But the ice near the shore was cracked, the edges blackened as if burned. We packed up in silence, leaving behind anything we couldn't carry. As we hiked back to the car, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. At one point, I glanced back and saw a faint outline on the lake, standing exactly where we had seen the figure the night before. None of us ever returned to that lake, and we don't talk about what happened. But sometimes, in the stillness of winter nights, I hear that faint tapping again, echoing in my mind, and I know that whatever was out there hasn't forgotten us. What seemed like an ordinary winter predator turned into something far worse, something that blurred the line between beast and nightmare. It was my first solo winter camping trip. I'd been camping countless times before, but never alone. And I wanted to prove to myself that I could handle it. The dense forest, blanketed in fresh snow, was serene and beautiful, a stark contrast to the hustle and bustle of city life I had left behind. I set up camp near a frozen creek, the perfect spot to enjoy a weekend of solitude. The first night was peaceful. I cooked dinner over a small fire and listened to the gentle creaks of the trees in the cold wind. The moonlight illuminated the snow, creating an almost magical glow. I sat in my tent, reading by lantern light until I drifted off to sleep. I woke suddenly in the middle of the night to a sound, a low growl, deep and guttural, that sent chills down my spine. At first, I thought it was a dream, but then I heard it again. Closer this time. Something large was outside the tent. I held my breath, my heart pounding as I listened to the crunch of snow and the snuffling of a creature just beyond the thin fabric. Slowly, I unzipped a small portion of the tent and peered out. A massive white wolf stood just feet away, its fur glistening in the moonlight. Its size was unnerving, larger than any wolf I'd ever seen, with eyes that glowed an unnatural yellow. It stared at the tent, unmoving, as if it knew I was watching. I retreated inside, praying it would go away. For hours, I sat frozen in fear as the wolf circled the campsite. Eventually, the sound stopped, and I must have fallen asleep from sheer exhaustion. The next morning, I found tracks in the snow, huge clawed footprints that circled my tent several times before leading off into the woods. I tried to shake off the unease, convincing myself it was just a hungry animal passing through. But that night, the wolf returned. It stood at the edge of the clearing, staring at me as I sat by the fire. Its presence was almost hypnotic, as if it were daring me to approach. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the creature, but the beam flickered and dimmed as soon as it touched the wolf. Then it let out a howl, a deep, bone-chilling sound that seemed to echo through the entire forest. I scrambled into the tent, zipping it up and clutching a hunting knife I had brought for protection. The wolf didn't leave this time. I could hear it pacing, its growls low and menacing. At one point, it scratched at the tent, tearing small holes in the fabric. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay another night. As I packed up, I felt eyes on me, but every time I looked around, the forest seemed empty. The hike back to the car was unnerving. The forest, so beautiful when I arrived, now felt oppressive and sinister. The snow muffled my footsteps, but I could hear something else. Something following me, keeping pace just out of sight. When I finally reached the car, I threw my gear inside and started the engine. As I pulled away, I looked in the rearview mirror. The wolf was standing in the middle of the trail, watching me go. Its eyes burned bright against the snow, and for a brief moment I thought I saw it change. Its form shifting, elongating, becoming something that was no longer just an animal. I didn't stop driving until I was back in the city. Even now, the memory haunts me. That wolf wasn't natural, and whatever it was, I know it wasn't just a beast. It was something ancient, something I never should have crossed paths with. Thanks for watching. Remember to like and subscribe for more videos.